Hey, house groups, on Sunday I talked about a character in the nativity story named Elizabeth. Elizabeth is related to Mary, and she's the mother of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. So Elizabeth is Jesus' aunt, and she has this unique role that she plays in the Christmas story. And I think what we can learn as we look at preparing room for Jesus to show up in new and significant ways in this chapter of our life, and especially as we look into this new year in 2026, we can learn about hope from Elizabeth. Elizabeth believes for the improbable. She believes for something that is actually maybe impossible for her. She desperately wants to have a child. Her and her husband Zechariah desperately want to have a child, and they can't. They can't have a child, and it's challenging for them. And so they grieve that loss. They experience a deep pain and a deep longing for that. But I think the thing that's remarkable about Elizabeth is she doesn't stop hoping. And then when God comes through for her, when it happens, she gives God the credit. The Bible talks a lot about gratitude, and it talks about praise. And what we see from Elizabeth is that her hope is filled with gratitude, and it's filled with praise. One way I think it can be helpful to think about gratitude is it's giving God the credit. God deserves the credit, and it's giving God the credit. Praise is giving God the glory. God deserves the glory, and so God gets the glory. And Elizabeth is an amazing example of how her hope endures throughout the impossible or the improbable. And then when the improbable happens, she gives God the thanks, and she gives God the praise. She gives God the credit, and she gives God the glory. And the convicting question for me to ask myself is, when God comes through for my life, because God makes and keeps promises, am I giving God the credit, and am I giving God the glory? Or am I holding back some of the credit? Am I holding back some of the glory? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving yourself all the credit. A lot of times we give circumstance a tremendous amount of credit. We almost go like, I'm going to default to just giving chance the credit. And I would encourage you to say, what if in 2026 you grew your hope, but you also just defaulted to give God credit more? So you said, you know what, it could be chance, but just in case it's God's specific activity in my life, I just want to give him the credit. I want to give him the glory. So Elizabeth and Zechariah have this deeply personal story, but it's also a microcosm of God's story with his people. And then it's sort of a reenactment of God's faithfulness in the past, in the Old Testament for Israel, enacting in the present with Elizabeth and Zechariah and John the Baptist, because John the Baptist is this ultimate person that God uses to prepare the way for Jesus the Messiah. So what we learn about hope from Elizabeth is that hope stays safe and it grows in prayer. We see this in the New Testament really clearly, really specifically. The Apostle Paul tells us that hope stays safe and it grows in prayer. So if you want to be a person who hopes, be a person who prays. We know that hope is a beacon. It guides others and it spurs them on. God wants to cause your hope to inspire other people. He wants it to light the way for other people. He wants it to be a beacon that shines for other people. Hope is also an anchor that encourages us to live differently. If you think about the life of Elizabeth and Zechariah, they have this opportunity to behave differently in the world because of the hope that they have. And so their hope resources them to show up differently in the world. It's this kind of firm foundation, this anchor. And so it's interesting that hope can be an anchor and that it also can be a beacon. And then finally, well-placed hope demands praise and gratitude to God. Our hope is well placed in Jesus Christ. One of my favorite songs talks about how God gave everything he possibly could in Jesus. And so that when we place our hope in Jesus, God has come through for us in the best way that he possibly could imagine to come through for human beings. There's nothing more for heaven to give because God has given us Jesus. God makes and keeps promises, and our hope is well placed when it's placed with God, and it's placed with the reality of the arrival the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And so, what are we doing with our lives to say thank you to God? What are we doing with our lives to give God the glory, especially this season when we remember that God is with us and that God is for us and God has acted and continues to act decisively on our behalf?